know, with the live stream, are we able to tell? We don't. Okay. Okay. You guys ready? You're good? Okay. Well, it feels funny to use a microphone for the small group. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Good evening to everyone who's joining us on the live stream. We thank you for joining us virtually. We miss you here in the sanctuary, but we are glad that you are able to partake in this program this evening. My name is Sharon Amsterbrown. I'm the Director of Education and Congregational Engagement here at the Temple. And this program is one of our final programs as part of our Joys of Jewish Learning offerings for this year. Hard to believe that we are in the throes of planning for next year already. This year we've been focusing on the theme of home, thinking about what it means to return home, to leave home, our Jewish homes, perhaps our native homes, our familial homes, and communal homes. So I'm so looking forward to this evening. This is a program that Adolfo and I have spoke about a long time ago, and it's finally happening. And as most of you know, our incredible moderator this evening is Adolfo Guzman-Lopes, longtime congregant and journalist in Southern California, and we're thrilled to have you here. And I will let Adolfo introduce our panelists, but I will just say that Natalie is wonderful, and I can't wait to hear from you this evening. So the program this evening is called Leaving Home, Finding Home. Thank you again for joining us.
Maybe leave it.
Oh, you don't
leave
need
it
that?
there. No, I'm wired.
Oh, you're wired.
I'm wired. Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. Yes, I'm Adolfo Guzman-Lopes. Let me just say a few words before I talk about Natalie and allow her to tell her stories. When I was thinking about the topic for tonight, I was thinking about how, stories are told to us, and we read stories about how human history is filled with, accounts of leaving home, obviously sometimes willingly, sometimes not. So that's human history. Oh boy, in the last decade, right, we can think about, all the stories out of Syria, Honduras, Ukraine, right? And that all made me think of a word in Spanish. Spanish is my first language. So the word desarraigado, which means somebody who's been uprooted, right? Desarraigado, which is a word that I grew up hearing a lot describing people like myself who left Mexico, came to the United States. And that's a state that Natalie finds herself in. We've talked beforehand, and I'm going to let her tell her stories. It's also, I've had conversations here in the synagogue over a span of over a decade with people from Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, North Africa, France, South Africa, Cuba, and they've told me similar stories, right, of feeling this uprootedness. But at the same time, those roots take root somewhere else. They have the ability to take root, and they remember what it's like to take root from that memory of the original soil, right? So this idea of leaving home, finding home, that's a topic of tonight's conversation. It could also be labeled immigration, right? We could also label it that way, stories of immigration, which leads us to think about how local, state, national policies, what's the status of those policies on immigration, and maybe how to better welcome people who come here to work and who are pushed out, for the most part, from their countries by politics, sometimes, by the United States policies. But you know what? That's a conversation for another day. So tonight's conversation really is doing what I think this community, the Temple Israel community, what I found is what we do best, which is tell stories, tell our own stories, and tell them from a heartfelt point, right? Natalie Susan joins me. What I'll say first, and then I'll let you give a thumbnail of kind of how you grew up, where you grew up, and that sort of thing. I've gotten to know Natalie over the last few years, her husband Ilan, and I have had great conversations. I can picture, before COVID over here in the social hall, right? After, in the Oneg, Friday nights and everything. And I had the pleasure of attending her son Eli's bar mitzvah a year ago. Oh, okay, in November, okay. And then Gwen running around, oh, bundle of energy, Gwen, right? So, Pepper Pot, okay. So Natalie, tell me, and I think the other thing for tonight is that, our community, we have these stories. I'm a nosy guy, and I have permission through my work to be a nosy guy. And I know that's not how people kind of go around in their lives, right? Being nosy. It's not polite to be nosy, actually. So sometimes, I have the privilege of talking to people and hearing their stories. But we walk around and then we find out, oh, wait a second, you're from Cuba? You immigrated? Oh, where'd you grow up? You grew up in Texas? And oh, right, right? So we walk around with these stories. Natalie, give me a thumbnail of where you grew up, your families before that, and that sort of thing.
So I still, even though I've been living in California for almost 30 years, I call Haiti home. My father is still there, my stepmother, most of my family on my father's side. There is a lot of migration. Obviously, the family has grown over the years. My uncle and aunt were the first to leave.
What year was that, more or less?
Oh, I could not tell you.
Okay.
I just know that, well, under Papa Doc, our family was one of the 9 families that had been persecuted. And my grandfather, my father's father, was raised by one of his sisters as a girl. There were like 8 or 9 sisters. They all had girls. And my great-grandmother had the only boy. So it was an easy enough lie to turn him into a girl and have another sister raise him.
Because as a boy, he'd be in danger.
Because as a boy, he would have been in danger. His family, our family is originally from the town of Jérémie, which is a very, it's a beautiful town. It's on the southern side of the island, and it has black sand beaches and mountains, and you get car sick going over the mountain, or I used to as a kid, but a lot of artists there. And it's a port town. But the families, the 9 families, were killed. Baby Doc had his henchmen kill the children and the mothers first in front of the men, and then have the men paraded in their birthday through town before being executed. So when my grandmother, whose father was one of the first black men to be educated in France as a medical doctor, her dream had been to move to France because her mother was from France. She's from the Ladurée family, a white woman. And when they came back to the island, and her brothers all married white French women, and when she was told that there wasn't enough money, I mean, it always came down to money, right? There wasn't enough money to set her up for her dowry and live in France, she was very disappointed. But did end up marrying my grandfather, who was white and from one of the original colonial families. So she had 3 kids, my aunt and my dad, and then my uncle. So my uncle and my aunt live in the Berkeley area. And my dad was basically shipped off to Mexico for his studies, which is where my parents met. My mom was on vacation after graduating University of Michigan. I guess I've kind of jumped around a little
And your
bit.
father was studying architecture? Is that
Yes,
it?
my father was studying architecture.
Okay. And he then went back to Haiti and.
Well, that was a number of years.
Yeah.
They did live in New York for about 5 years, which is where my sister and I were born. And then when Papa Doc died and Baby Doc took over, and his reign was less bloody, one of my father's uncles, he had 3 uncles, asked him to come back to the island and build a house, which would be a house and a restaurant on a piece of property that they had. And my dad also saw it as an opportunity to work with my grandfather, who was also an architect, but also an engineer and a lawyer. So we left Mamaroneck and went for about a year to get the project started. My mom got pregnant with my sister, and we went back, and so she was also born in New York. And then they saw that the government was pretty much hands-off, as opposed to the dad's reign. And so my dad decided he'd had enough living as an expat, and he wanted to go home.
Some of my earliest memories, well, not earliest, but maybe 7 or 8 years old, would be that during the summers, we would go, often take the bus to central Mexico. So my mother is from the state of Guanajuato, which is almost the geographic center of Mexico. So we'd stay there for about a week, visit with with her sisters and brothers, that sort of thing. Then we go to Mexico City because we have a lot of relatives there. So I almost like lived in 2 worlds because I was there, I was in central Mexico for at least 2 weeks, pretty much every summer. And now I think it's such a blessing that they did this. Couldn't have been cheap. They didn't work, and they didn't have vacation days to take. They didn't have the kind of jobs. My mom cleaned houses for a living. My stepfather was a maintenance guy at a large apartment complex. I doubt he had vacation days, but maybe he did. So they spent the money and the time to do that. You kind of did a similar situation in which where were you spending time as a kid back and forth in the summers? What was the pattern?
Yeah, so my parents split up. I was about 8, and I have a 3rd sister, and she was born in Haiti. It just wasn't where my mom wanted to be, but because of, help me out here, I'm going to mess it up again, Napoleonic law.
There you go.
Okay, I got it.
On peut parler en français.
Oui, tout le monde ne parle pas français. So because of Napoleonic law, my father had custody of us, and if she left, she would literally never see us again. But they had a relatively amicable separation, and so we stayed with him for the most part of the week, and on the weekends we were with her. But in the summer, she had 2 weeks vacation. She used to work for Coleco, and they made Cabbage Patch dolls. This is the 70s, early 70s, late 60s. And we would get on Pan Am or Eastern and fly to New York, JFK, and her father still lived in Mamaroneck, and we would go sailing with him for a week or so.
That's in
Long Island.
In Long Island.
Sorry.
Okay.
And then she would then take his car and drive up 4.5 hours up Interstate, I want to say 5.
I'm Southern California, sorry.
Up to New York, and or 91. It was the 91 once you got out of Massachusetts. And my grandparents, so I had 2 grandfathers, my mother's biological father and the man that my grandmother married later on. But he pretty much was, he was our grandfather too. And they had bought a retired farm in Vermont, right smack in the middle of Vermont, tiny little town by the name of Rochester. If you blink, you miss it, off Route 100. And Mom would spend 1 week with her mom and her stepdad, and so her stepsisters would come and visit with her kids and their kids. And it was just a cousin fest. It was awesome because I really never knew my father's side of the family, who was up in Northern California. And she would go back to Haiti and leave us for all of the 13 weeks of summer. in Vermont on this farm, 3 girls, with nothing to do, but a pond and some horses.
Wow.
And dogs. And it was heaven. It was, looking back on that, if I could do that for my kids, you know, this was before my grandfather was, the only TV we watched was Dan Rather. It was black and white, and I'll never forget this. We were sitting around the kitchen table, and keep in mind, in Haiti, this is a third world country, so we don't have regular power. We certainly don't have TV. The TV we did have was hijacked signals that was then being rebroadcast by the government program. It was kind of hilarious when you look at like the things that I knew now, if I knew then. But yeah, so we spent our summers in Vermont, and that was our US home. And at the end of summer, before school started, my grandparents would drive the 5.5 hours to LaGuardia and put us on the plane, and we had our badges, and we were unaccompanied minors, and to be recuperated on the island by our parents. And we did that until Baby Doc was ousted.
For me, my experience, you know, going to Mexico, language was very important, and accents. And to this day, if I hear somebody from central Guanajuato, it just brings back just an avalanche of memories of my uncles. And I can recognize that accent from kind of around where my mom grew up. Was that similar for you in terms of language and accents?
So I grew up speaking, Mom was American, obviously, and
she spoke English
she spoke English to us. So our home language was English when we were with her. We went to school through the lycée program, so our home language 5 days a week was French. Our school language was French. The language of the household was Creole, Haitian Creole. And because Dad went to school in Mexico, and a lot of his friends who were also coming back to the island under the benevolent, I call him a benevolent dictator.
Because he wasn't as bad as
because he wasn't as bad as his dad.
Right.
And I can say, as an adult now looking back, and having been there since he's been deposed, that the island was better off for it. Back then, you had foreign countries who brought in business and were teaching agriculture and building roads, and the hospitals were staffed, and there was medicine on the shelves, and there was food readily available in the grocery stores. I remember hanging out as a teenager there's a street where all the little bars are, and David Lee Roth was there, and you know, it was safe. I mean, I grew up in the streets. I was the minority. Everybody wanted to touch my hair. I was very, very blonde as a child. I have my dad's green eyes, but my sisters are all darker haired. Being in the sun all the time, obviously I was a lot darker tanned-wise, but I was a grimel. I was a white kid running around barefoot with a whole bunch of black kids. And when I moved to the States and started going to school here, one of the things that was very hurtful to me was my dad came to visit when I started college at the University of Vermont, and they were shocked. They're like, "That's your dad? He's black." My dad isn't much darker than Adolfo, but I was not aware of the racism and the culture shock of everybody was going out to go drink and get drunk. I'd been drinking in bars since I was 12 years old. I would have a gin and tonic or a glass of wine, and that was, you know, just to kind of get comfortable and just loosen your tongue and talk to strangers, but it wasn't a pastime to go out and drink. And those were the two things that it took me a really long time to get over. And I fear for my own children now that that's what they're going to do, because that's what everybody else does, and worse. I was definitely living in a bubble and very sheltered. So.
You know, I've been at work. I'm a reporter for KPCC, Southern California Public Radio, and I'm working on a podcast right now, finishing it up. And one of the reason I bring it up is that the podcast includes quite a bit of my own personal story. And one of the things that we've written in, when I say we, I'm working on it with a team of people, an editor and a producer, and we've had lots of meetings in which when it comes to the point of including my story, it's been really hard. It's been difficult because I think it's because I really have just these kind of big milestone moments, right, and images, and I haven't, kind of the details are a bit lost, right? So one of the details that I'm finding is lost. Maybe a photograph will allow me to recover it. Is that moment? So I was born in Mexico City at about 3 years old. My mom and I came to Tijuana. My parents split up. It wasn't a very bad breakup. They still loved each other. They just
couldn't live together.
Failure to communicate. Right? They were both a little bit knuckleheads. Now I can say that, right? So we came to Tijuana. We lived there until I was about 7. The memory I'm looking for is that day when we moved to San Diego, and we were crossing with U.S. visas. So we had a Mexican passport, both of us, and we acquired tourist visas, right? Which is very common, right? But my mom was working in the United States, and she was bringing me, right, before I was school age. And then all of a sudden we just stayed, right? We overstayed our visas, which is a common thing. So we were undocumented. But I don't remember that day of when it's like, oh, we just didn't go back. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, okay, well, we had to have brought our things, some things, our clothes. And in this process of putting this podcast together, I remembered that there was an arrangement with one of the women my mom worked for, a lady whose house she cleaned. And the lady said, okay, you can use the spare room and you can bring your son, you can live in the spare room. She had 3 kids. She had 3 young kids, probably around my age. 2 of them were 1 and 2 years older than me, and 1 was younger than me. Stay in the spare room in exchange for you, getting them ready for school, doing the cooking, and then doing the cooking in the evening, and some cleaning and some laundry and all that. And my mom thought, oh, that's a good arrangement, but it ended up being terrible. It was a lot of work, right? Not only that, and this is in the podcast, there was an incident, as my mom tells it, that the lady didn't realize that with 2 more people, there would be 2 more people eating food. And so there was less food in the house. And so she took it up with my mom. Oh, your son's eating me, right? Eating a lot.
Wow.
And my mom just, oh my God, it was an insult. It was a total slap in the face to her. So that's when she called the man who would become my stepfather and said, hey, come get us, and we moved in with it. All that leading up to the question to you of when was that day where you didn't go back, and did you know? Were you told?
That day is seared. I remember, so back then, the only way to communicate with Haiti from the island was through a ham radio. And we were living in a teeny tiny town. So we had to, my mom knew someone who knew someone who knew someone. And we had this very echoey conversation with Dad every couple of weeks. And
wait a second, the conversation was in between towns in Haiti?
No, from Vermont to a bigger city, like to find an operator. So we were talking in the regular, rotary phone, which is now defunct, but we were talking into a phone, but it was being relayed a couple of different places in order to get to the ham operator, who could then call my father on the island.
In Haiti?
In Haiti.
Okay.
And I remember overhearing my parents talking, and I was like, wow, they're not fighting. What's going on? And of course, you know, it was this tiny little office my grandfather, who was also an architect, had, and I was eavesdropping on the bedroom side. And I got so mad because my dad said, no, you're going to have to stay. Just keep them there. Just come back and get their stuff. You're going to have to stay. And my first reaction was like, oops, sorry, microphone, was, Dad doesn't love us anymore, or we did something horrible.
Oh, hold on, I don't quite get it. He was saying that to your mom?
To my mom.
That she would have to stay in Vermont?
Yeah, not to come back, not to bring us back to Haiti. Oh. And this was in 1984. So wow. This was, Duvalier was escorted, courtesy of the US government, in 85, December of 85. So summer of 84, we stayed in Vermont. Mom went back, packed everything up, and then resettled in Vermont in her mom's house with us. And I didn't see my dad for, I think, about 3 years. And the only reason I did see him was because one of his nephews was getting married in Berkeley. But he used to do some work for Duvalier as an architect. He built a couple schools and some hospitals. And so he knew some of the generals, and he started seeing the writing on the walls, if you will, that there was going to be a change in government. And
because he was allied with Duvalier, that would mean his life would be in danger?
I don't know that he ever felt that his life was in danger, because my dad is a special guy. He kind of just, he skirts around things. He never really goes deep in, but he's aware of he knows everybody knows who he is. His work is quite special, very different, not your run-of-the-mill architect. He understudied with Frank Lloyd Wright, so that kind of gives you an idea of the creativity. But so he knew what was going on, but he wasn't involved. And he knew enough to say that it wasn't going to be safe, and he didn't want us on the island when it was going to happen. He always said that you have to go to the States, you have to get educated in the States. Our options were obviously France or the US, but we didn't have French citizenship. We had US citizenship. And that was the plan. The three of us all went to university in the US, and for him, it was the land of opportunity, even though he hated every minute of it.
So Natalie, how old were you when that happened, that you had to stay?
I was 15.
You were 15?
Yeah.
So that meant that
you'd
be enrolled in school.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Because I was at the lycée, and the program there is so much more comprehensive, if you will.
Sure.
I had just finished my baccalaureate for languages, and I was supposed to do the last year, which is when you choose your pathway, and I was going to do math and econ. I originally wanted to be an astronaut, but we didn't have a science teacher for a few years because of the embargo. It's funny that you mentioned the things that you forgot and now you're trying to remember again. I'm noticing that with myself too. But I ended up having to enroll in this tiny little town's high school. I think there were 200 kids with a graduating senior class of 20, and I was one of them. Wow. Because I had never had US history. So as a requirement to apply to US colleges, I had to take US history. So for a year of school, my activities were AP Algebra, PE. I'd never done PE, so I joined the basketball team. What did I know about basketball? But it was definitely a trip, man. We would get on the bus, we would go to the away games. I spent so much time in the senior lounge, it was ridiculous. But I had to have that AP class, or that US history class, and then I was able to apply to to U.S. college. And
Natalie, was that first year painful for you?
I was definitely an outsider. I was made fun of because I wasn't wearing jeans and t-shirts and sneakers. You know, we're talking about a small dairy farm town. And I came from, I mean, we were not wealthy by any means in Haiti, but we were middle class. I wore skirts and blouses and shoes, and I still wore that stuff because that's the clothes that I had when I went to Rochester High. I think the word "stuck up" was thrown around quite a bit before they got to know me, and I think that's one of the main reasons why I joined the basketball team, so that I could hang out and make some friends.
What got you through that time?
My grandparents.
Who were living there.
Who were living there. Yeah, we were living,
Vermont.
because at that point in time, my mom had gotten a job. She ended up moving to Connecticut, and she didn't want to uproot me again because I was in my senior year in high school, and I had already applied to colleges, so I knew where I was going to go. But my grandparents were, that was a beautiful, I mean, that was a love story that just was a foundation for me, because coming from a household of divorce and feeling like I was ripped from my home, to have their connection, or to see their connection. I learned how to use a chainsaw with my grandfather. I learned how to milk a cow. I drank milk warm from the cow. God, I can't even think that I did that.
Yeah, and you have to build up to that. You can't.
Oh no, it was
arrive at a farm and do that.
It was bonkers. But it was this 300 acres in the middle of the mountains, and it was quiet. It was everything that the island wasn't. I can't say that I made some lifelong friends from there, but there still is a curiosity. You know, Facebook was huge. When Haiti had that earthquake, there were people that had been trapped in buildings, in grocery stores, sending out messages saying, "Hey, I'm still here." And I kind of reconnected with the Haitian friends that I had had for so many years. And
when you talk about your grandparents, you're reminding me of my aunt Trinidad in Tijuana. So she had been the pioneer, and had come. I mean, Tijuana in the 60s was, you know, the place. It was so small, and there were not very many, you know, families that had been there for generations, right? So, you know, in Mexico, you went there like to escape your family, or if you got a divorce, or, you know, you wanted to get away from the constraints of a conservative town. So my aunt Trinidad, who was my mother's father's sister, ended up there. My mom and I would go there. It felt like every weekend, but maybe it was every other weekend, maybe it was once a month. So she had 3 kids who were all kind of late teens, early 20s. The ones who were in university were studying to be teachers. So there were books all around, and there would be big gatherings where there would be, you know, aunts and uncles from Mexico City. So there was a lot of conversation. And, you know, people from Mexico City are like New Yorkers, you know, they feel they're, you know, God's gift to the humanity, right? And they're talkative, right? Talkative is, I think, is a bigger point, is like, you know, they're very, and you know, very upfront, right? And so that's the household, and cousins. It almost sounds like you had some of that, right?
yeah, it was my grandfather's daughters. He had 3 daughters, and the eldest had 8 or 9 kids, and so they were in Annapolis, and some were in New York. So the farmhouse was the, talking about defining moments, when we had to sell that piece of property because my grandfather got ill and we needed to be closer to civilization. That, I still look that address up and look it up on Google to see if the Rokers have done anything to it or what they've done to it. And my sisters and I always used to say, we're going to buy it back, you know, we're going to go back there. But yeah, that farmhouse in Vermont was huge. That was like an anchor, if you will. But that's where a lot of things happened.
I want to make
growing up.
a couple of points, and then we'll open it up to the audience. You know, I mentioned in the beginning, you know, kind of these you know, kind of these countries that come to mind in the last decade that have been, you know, kind of sources of, there's been conflict there, you know, Syria, Honduras, Ukraine. I'm wondering if in, you know, any of those cases or other cases, you know, either through the videos that come to us on our phones or in the news or anything, you see certain situations. Do they take you back to what you lived in any way?
Yeah.
They do?
January 6th was very difficult for us.
Oh, wow. Why is that?
I had no clue what was going on. I was actually working with my son's middle school in a adult, they call it an advisory class. But that day, my stepmother called me, and she was in Haiti. And she's like, they're storming the Capitol. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I had her on WhatsApp, and I'm looking at stuff on the internet, and I'm holding up my phone to my computer screen so she can see what I'm seeing. And there were these, I mean, we all know what happened, but we were crying.
That incident looked different from the point of view of somebody who's gone through toppling of governments in their own country than from the point of view of somebody who's lived in a country that feels like it's on top of the world.
Yeah, for sure. There was something that you mentioned a while back that I remembered. When I hear other languages, especially when I hear French or Creole, I get really nosy because it's like, ooh, who are they? And where are they from?
And you can recognize the type of French where it's coming from, right?
Exactly, yeah. And do I want to talk to them? Or, but I remember as a kid in New York, and we would go visit all New York City, and I could recognize an African American from the Caribbean versus an African American who was born here by the way they walked. They didn't even have to open their mouth. Now I can identify it. As a kid, I didn't know what it was. There is a swagger and an entitlement versus a curiosity and appreciation for the world from someone who has had to leave everything behind. So that was to the point that you were making about listening for languages, and I keep hitting that. Sorry, I'm not used to having a mic.
Your reaction and your aunt's reaction to the storming of the Capitol reminds me that my close friend, who's Chilean and whose parents left Chile after the Pinochet coup, my friend's mother in San Diego was seeing January 6th, and she was getting flashbacks. Mm-hmm. You know, they left that. And for those of you who don't know the story, Augusto Pinochet used jets to bomb the presidential palace.
Yeah.
So it's understandable, right?
Our presidential palace still hasn't been rebuilt.
Wow. When I talked to you, Natalie, I asked you, or you told me that Haiti to this day feels like home. Mm-hmm. Why? Explain that.
I don't know. It's just maybe because I've never felt like I could embrace the U.S. as a home. It just feels so big. There's so many differences from one side to the other, and then I don't really like to use it because a lot of people think of it as a pejorative term, but the flyover states. My husband and I had an opportunity to drive coast to coast, and it really could be different countries. I like Long Beach. This is the longest I've lived of anywhere. I mean, I did about 20 years on the East Coast, but
Long Beach feels manageable. Feels like,
it was funny because when I came out here because of a job and a guy, we moved out from Connecticut together, and when we were driving, we were living in the company that moved us, or that he was working for, had put us up at the Oakwood Apartments in Marina Del Rey, and we would drive PCH down, and when we came to 2nd Street, which back then was lovely, it felt like Cape Cod to us, which we were very familiar with. And we're like, okay, this is where we want to settle. And we had both had jobs working in downtown LA. But yeah, Long Beach felt like a big enough city. It had a symphony, it has orchestra, it has theater. Coming from New York, being the proximity of New York City, going to the Met and doing all the stuff there, the Broadway shows that my mom and I used to do. Long Beach felt good. And obviously my husband of today, not the guy that I moved out here for, he was originally from, I don't know if he's watching, so I have to watch what I'm saying. But he's from Hollywood via Canada, and his parents are Moroccan. And his siblings were born in Israel, so that's another migration story. It was easy for him to leave the Beverly Hills, Hollywood area and settle here with me.
So Natalie, I'm carrying my migration story differently now at my age. I think how am I carrying it differently? I think I'm talking more about it. I think I'm being more unapologetic about it.
You're not hiding it or making excuses
I'm not hiding
for it?
Well, actually, it's a step beyond not hiding it. I remember when I grew up going to schools where my mom cleaned houses. So it's a mostly white, middle-class part of it was Pacific Beach, La Jolla in San Diego, right? So I grew up, I didn't grow up with any Mexican kids there, although when we went home in National City, it was a Mexican-Filipino neighborhood, right? Mixed neighborhood. So now when people ask me what I am, even though I've spent most of my life in the United States, I say I'm Mexican because that's kind of that defines me. I'm a US citizen. I'm no longer undocumented. I'm American. I'm also Mexican-American, but I'm also Chicano. Chicano, the term being a Mexican-American who's politicized, who believes in social action. For those of you in the audience who know me here in the Temple Israel setting, I'm devoted to Torah, right? I'm committed. I like to say that I'm a practicing non-Jew because I haven't converted, right?
We've talked about that.
We've talked about this, right?
Well, we had interim rabbi, and then we had COVID, and maybe now it's time to think about it again.
And so, I mean, I hold all these identities, and I'm moving forward in the world. I'm wondering, with your Haitian identity and the other identities, how do you hold them differently now than you did before?
I don't think anybody has ever really asked me, well, where are you from? Because I don't have an accent. A lot of people, if I say I'm from Haiti, they're like, what? Well, you don't have an accent.
And is that a long conversation
That's usually what happens. And my mom's dad was a spy in World War II for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. And my grandfather, this is the one who lived in Mamaroneck with the sailboat, for those of you keeping track, she went to 16 different schools in less than 12 years. And she used to say that she's a citizen of the world. And I always wanted to be able to say that too, but I've only lived in 2 places. I mean, I've traveled in a lot of places, but I've always loved that. She said that. But to go back to your question, why does Haiti feel like home? Probably because even though I had my grandparents in Vermont on that idyllic farm, that's where I grew up with my sisters. It's where my mom and my dad were, where we were a family unit. And I'm getting all choked up. My mom passed actually her yard site's next week.
Sorry to hear.
And it's funny because I've taken my kids there. It's been a little while, but my son's been there twice. My daughter's been there once. She was 4 the last time. My dad's come here a couple of times with my stepmother. My kids refer to it as home.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
And when my dad's had some health issues, and when we were talking as a family of how do we get him to get off the island and someplace where there's more services, my son did not want to participate in that because he's like, no, I don't want to lose Opa. I don't want him to come here. I want him to stay there because I want to go back. And it was so forceful.
That's so perceptive of him,
Yeah.
of your son, to see that, recognize that, and say, you know, you'd be desarraigar.
Yeah.
You'd be taking something from the roots.
We call ourselves diaspora, right?
Yeah, what is
The
it?
diaspora.
Diaspora. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
So, yeah. I mean, my husband has this urban gardening concept that we're trying to implement, and he's already thought about how we could make it work down there so that we could help people. I remember when I was in college, I was thinking, I want to go back and I want to teach them. My undergraduate degree is in plant and soil, and I want to teach them how to grow food for themselves the way the Germans did when they were there with their huge corporations. I remember, I'll never forget German is not a language I speak, but the logo of the yellow and black on the side of their equipment, that was all over the country. Building rice paddies and irrigation and all of that. So.
I don't know if I have any I don't know if I have any answers or policy proposals for how to, you know, make us a more tolerant community, state, nation, but other than continuing to tell these stories, right? To tell these stories.
I was very pleased. I think it was 2 weekends ago, Catherine Porter, who was originally from Montreal, and there's a huge Haitian community in Montreal. Haitians are either in Montreal, which is ridiculously cold, and I could never understand that. When I went to school to Vermont, and I would go and visit my friends.
Well, that's only the French language?
Like, why are you there?
Yeah.
Well, because Montreal opens its doors to everyone, or Canada opens its doors. It welcomed the Moroccans, my husband's family. It welcomed the Haitians.
And recently,
again, the French,
gave visas to people from Mexico, too, recently.
And then Miami. Miami is where a lot of them, and New York, too, but where was I going with this?
The welcoming, I think you're talking about. Maybe that allows us to get into.
Oh, Catherine Porter. So
sorry.
she has been, for someone who is not Haitian to go back to the island 40 times in the last 10 years, you have got to have fallen in love with it. And that's, my friends who've been there, all say the same thing. The people are so nice. Here you have people who live with nothing, and they are so nice and so welcoming, and they will give you everything that they have. You don't see that here. But Catherine Porter wrote an article about why the first Black nation who got rid of the white man's rule has not been able to rise up. And because by all accounts, it should be much more similar to the Dominican Republic or to some of the South American countries. And it's because of the debt that they had to pay to France. And this is something that I knew growing up there because I had to learn Haitian history and why things are the way they are. But the fact that she's now shedding light on that, I'm really hoping that the French government, and I know that it's been tossed around, they've talked about it in the past, that some real change is going to come. And because we always say, you know, after the hurricanes and the earthquakes and the presidential assassination, it's like, when is this island ever going to catch a break?
And even though I just said that I don't have any policy proposals, I think one of the things that can be done on many levels, you know, starting with, you know, kind of the group, the congregations, the city, the state, is to recognize and to say that we are a multiplicity of people, right? Actually recognize that by, when we gather a lot of people, by saying our communities are made up of, you know, Spanish speakers, Russian speakers, you know, Hebrew speakers, you know, people from different parts of the world, and recognize that, you know, have us face that and say, oh yeah, to increase the tolerance. Not tolerance, welcoming. It's not tolerance isn't the right word.
That brings an interesting point, because I am not Jewish by birth. My dad's brother married a Jewish woman, so my cousins were brought up in the faith, and I was aware of it. My grandmother was a stout Catholic and took us to Mass on Sundays. My mother's family were Episcopalian and Quakers. So, and then you have the voodoo on the island. And then I had a stepmother who was a Buddhist. So I like to say that I am a multi-religious I've been exposed to. And it was not a difficult decision when I met Elon, that we were going to raise our children Jewish and live a Jewish life. But one of the things that I found fascinating when we went to Israel for our honeymoon is you're laying on the beach after, you know, a long day of whatever, but you would hear Russian and Spanish and French and English and all of these different languages, and the commonality was the religion. It was Hebrew. They would go back and forth in between the language of their land and the language of their religion. And that kind of, I mean, I guess it sealed the deal for me, in the sense that I felt that this is a religion and a people that is around the globe. And it's not just about Israel, but it's about the customs. So I think that home here in the U.S. is definitely the synagogue and the amazing people that I've met here.
That's what I feel like too. I go about being in Long Beach or LA County or other places, and I've had this feeling, I don't know how it's going to come across, I've had this feeling that there's just too many people in the world for me to try to, you know, understand everybody. I think it's enough to, you know try to get to know this community. That's challenge enough, right? You know, but this is a manageable challenge, I think, to me, and for me to present myself as who I am, you know, unapologetically. I think does a service for me. It does a service for everybody else to know that, you know, we live in a place, you know, with a lot of Spanish names for a reason, because this used to be Mexico and they used to be something else before that, and you know, we got to face that. And now I think one of the great things about this rising consciousness of Native American knowledge is that we're even forced to go back even further, right? To really think, oh wow, what was this land like before there were native buildings, right? Who, you know, Puvunga, right, which was the Tongva name of this area. Well, it's really forcing us to look at that community, and that community is still here.
Yeah.
That community is still here. It hasn't disappeared, right? We're not talking ancient history.
No.
So yeah, let's wrap it up. Any final things you want to say, Natalie, about home, immigration story? Maybe how you talk to your kids about it, or any recent comment that they've made about that's caught your ear?
Well, my daughter's in 4th grade, so she had to build a mission. And I know, right? So she chose the very first one, and it's still standing, and it's still an active mission, and it's in San Diego. So over break, we went down there and did the tour. And she really, well, obviously she's being raised Jewish, but she did not have some very nice things to say about Father Sarah and the conquistadors. And it was funny because when my dad was sitting right here for my son's bar mitzvah, one of the things that he begrudged me was the fact that I wasn't going to be a practicing Christian anymore. Not that I ever was, but don't tell him that. But when he witnessed my son's bar mitzvah, he came away at peace, and he told me that he really appreciated everything that I had done and how I had gone off and done my thing, and the work that I put into the program and explaining everything, because most of my family is non-Jewish, and I wanted to make sure that they knew that this was the Bima, and this is why we did this, and when we say Israel, we don't mean we mean the whole people. I think he came away as much as a ingrained Catholic can, with a new appreciation for Judaism.
That's great.
And again, I lost my train of thought.
No, that was
Dang
a
it,
good,
I'm getting
good
old.
concluding thought. Absolutely.
But yeah, it just, Temple Israel is our home here,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel the same way.
and all of you.
Thank you. So let's open it up. I don't know, any questions, comments? I talked to a couple here earlier, and I don't know if we want to start with you, sir, if you want to talk a little bit about, we've got some microphones there, about your immigration story. Maybe we can open up. You can say your name and any reactions, comments, questions, and share your story.
Yeah, my name is Eduardo. My name is Eduardo James. I'm originally from Panama, and I came to this country in 1972.
Go ahead and put the mic to your
To Miami.
There we go. You can leave your mask on. Just put it closer.
And the fact is that I came with $75 in my pocket and just had enough of Noriega, who at the time was a sort of a dictator coming up. So I came to Miami, and my brother had set me up with a Panamanian friend of his. And when I got to her house, she said that I wasn't welcome, that I wanted to come and change the laws. And I said, I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to, find a place for my family. So she allowed me to stay there. Actually, her sons allowed me to stay there that night. And the following day, they directed me where I should go. So I found a hotel on Biscayne Boulevard, downtown Miami. The name was Hotel Colón.
Oh, no.
And I remembered it because one of my aunties is from Colón in Panama. So I went up there, and I had my suitcase and a Bible. I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. So I had my green Bible and went up, and I saw this manager, and I asked him, I said, how much was the room? And he said it was $35 a week. So I paid the $35 a week. And then I ate once a day because I didn't have any money to actually splurge or do anything. So the following day, I took a bus and went all the way up to 181st Street and walked back, going into each businesses trying to find a job. And finally, when I got down to 1100 Biscayne Boulevard, there was the Howard Johnson's right across from the Bicentennial Park that was being built at the time. And I met this lady. Her name was Mary May, and she welcomed me in and asked if I knew how to wait tables. And I said, of course I know how to wait tables. And she says, wait on those 4 people there in those booths. And it so happened that they were all Hispanic. So I started speaking Spanish to them because that's my first language. So from there on, I, I became a waiter, and 3 months later, I became a midnight manager and short order cook because the cooks wouldn't show up because it was a 24-hour operation, and we were saddled with pimps and streetwalkers and drunks and everything at that time. So, I kind of fought through it, and right there I solved food and I had money at the same time, where it was tips. And finally I was able to bring my family. And then when I brought my family over at the time, my then wife, she had lupus. I had actually principio de lupus, beginnings of lupus. And then her mother came and said, "Oh, you should come back home." And my kids at the time were 5 and 7. So they took my family. She came and took my family home. And then I couldn't leave because I was on overstay, and I had to then, so then at that time I applied for a green card. So they said if I left, I would have a problem and I couldn't come back. So I had to stay in town. So I didn't have my kids didn't see them for 7 years because she wouldn't let them travel and I couldn't leave the country. So for 7 years I spoke to my kids, but I wasn't able to see them. And then finally, 1989, I was able to, I got my residency and everything, and I went home May 89 and got my kids because she called me and says, "Come get these kids because Noriega is kidnapping kids off, from school and whatnot." And so I did. So May 89, I went home, which I call home. I still call it home today. Got my kids, brought them back, and started a life. I remarried in 85, and I thought after you being married for 23 years, that was it. But my then wife decided that she didn't want to be married anymore after we built a business. I had a catering service and worked for Allstate Insurance and did everything and built a house in a place they call the Estates. Had a 6,800 square foot home and had everything. And it just went on down. I had a nervous breakdown. So finally, I left there, and my son was getting ready to go to Iraq in 2005. And he said, "Dad, why don't you come to California?" I said, "No, I'm going back to Miami because that's where it all started." He said, "Look, we just had a grandson, and my wife is from Scotland, and it'll do you some good." So I did. So I drove from Atlanta, Georgia, to San Diego with no money. Somehow, every time I put my debit card in, it gave me gas. So,
That's all you needed, huh?
so when I got to San Diego, I found back then it was Wachovia. It was Wachovia Bank, which is now Bank of America. So I went there and I told them what was happening and that there was going to be this bill coming, that if we could work it out. And the lady said, "Absolutely." So I started washing cars, doing pressure washing 7-Elevens so I could have something to do. And then I came up to Long Beach. Well, actually, I met my cousin had a dear friend that knew Lori and knew her from the book club. It was a setup. I didn't know it was a setup. They knew that I liked to cook, so it was 5 women and me, and one was Lori. So I met Lori that day, and the rest is history.
The rest is history,
and
right?
now
Yeah.
here we are in Long Beach.
Thank you for sharing. That's
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, yeah. Anybody else have any comment or question? Yep.
Well, as a native New Yorker, I can relate to what you say. You did leave out one thing. We all have a touch of arrogance. Because when I arrived in Los Angeles, I go, "This is a city?"
Yeah.
So, anyway, but my question to you is about the French debt. Does Haiti still have that debt? And if so, for how long? And do you see, when they pay it off, that there's a brighter future?
Well, so my understanding is that the debt has been paid off. but because it was so crushing, they never were able to build the infrastructure that a developing country would need, and services. I mean, the power is being provided, the power, even when I was living there in the 70s and 80s, we had blackouts. We had rolling blackouts. We had, I mean, if we had 3 hours of power a day, it was a good day. We had to have backup generators. We never drank milk or had ice cream or cheese unless it was going to be consumed that day, because we lived by candlelight. So basic stuff like, how are you going to provide electricity for this humongous city and its sprawling suburbs? The hydroelectric dam, it's still the same one, and it hasn't been repaired. And so now people with means, what they do is they'll put solar panels, and I knew about solar panels and inverters before it became a craze here. So that debt and having to repay it crippled them. And then you had the Duvaliers who were skimming the pot. And then everybody that's been there since, they've pretty much opened up the doors to the drug trade, and that's how they're, I mean, I understand why the US wants to keep such a close eye on it, because it's a stepping stone for especially Colombia. I mean, they're saying that the presidential assassination was because of the Colombian drug lords, that it's a stepping stone to Miami, to bringing cocaine in. As a kid, I was oblivious and clueless, but as an adult and having been there, I was like, oh, that's how that family ended up, you know.
Put it together.
You put the pieces together.
Yeah.
So it started off behind the 8 ball, if that explains the question.
Yeah.
The roads that were being built have been there since the 60s and 70s when the Germans were there. There was the occupation in the 50s with the Marines. They did do some infrastructure, but the basic stuff, from power to sewage to trash, it never materialized.
Do we have?
The opera.
Yes, I do.
Adolfo, I got a question from one of the viewers from the chat room.
Oh, good. Yes, online.
When Natalie says she had no science teacher because of embargo, which embargo are you talking about? The embargo against Cuba?
No, the embargo against Haiti.
Okay.
There was embargo.
There was an embargo in the.
I think they can Google embargo Haiti, United States, and get some more details.
It was in the 80s. There was rationing at the grocery stores. Most of the products that we ended up getting would come from France, because we couldn't get anything from the U.S.
And probably like the Cuban embargo, if other countries wanted to trade with Haiti, the United States would do some kind of, try to put a stop to that or something. Yeah. Joanne?
Had our author, when we did our book here, and I remember the author saying, and she fled the Middle East. She came to the United States, Persian, fled Iran, and lived here most of her life. And she said that was still home, you know, but it was a cognitive dissonance for her because she fled for her life. Neither of you fled for your life to come to this country. But when you hear, and she still said it was home. And to me, the word home evokes safety and comfort and good things and family. And yet you both say the place you came from was home. Is it with rose-colored glasses that you can still say that? Or is it, and I don't mean to be negative about it. I'm just curious how, especially when somebody has fled for their life, can still say some places they're home. And it's just a rhetorical question for you both to answer.
Let me give you the example of somebody who I've interviewed who has fled for her life. About 10 years ago, I talked to a woman who was a journalist in Ciudad Juárez by the name of Dolores Dorantes. So she was a journalist there, grew up there, was writing for newspapers in Ciudad Juarez, was also writing some columns for Mexico City publications, being very critical about the Mexican drug war and its approach, and it leading to so many deaths. So she received threats, and people came to her house, would show up and would tell her details of her life that she hadn't shared with people, right? So she was intimidated, she was followed, she ultimately left Ciudad Juarez and hasn't returned. She applied for political asylum in the United States. She got it, very rare case. And yeah, she still calls Ciudad Juarez home. For me, I think what you're getting at is there were problems. Yeah, why can't Mexico be a country where, I suppose, where there are opportunities, I suppose. Why can't it do better? It is home for me because that's where, my grandparents are buried. It's where, I still have memories of my aunt Carmelita in Mexico City, in her small kitchen and sitting down, and the memories of the memories of her being the first one to open the door to the family apartment when she was probably 19, and my father bringing me as a, I don't know, 1 month old, a couple weeks old, whatever, and saying, hey, here's my son, and she was the first one to receive me and see me, and that's why she loved me for so many years, right? That's what makes it home, those things. Yeah, the politics are problematic, aren't they? The problem, of our home countries.
I think, politics aside, it's in having this conversation with you all, it's home because as a child, I remember baking with my grandmother, having my great uncles come and every afternoon and have coffee or whatever. If it was once a week, sometimes I feel like it was every day, but maybe it was just once a week. It's like I said before, growing up, being a kid with my sisters and sharing a room, and both my parents living there. When my parents split up and I moved to the States, my dad is still in Haiti, and my mom went from Vermont to Connecticut to DC. So that cohesiveness of our nuclear family and then the extended family, all the cousins, even the ones that came just for the summers visiting from France because they went to school there, the marriages broke up and they went back to the other families or where they chose to live. I think that's maybe what it makes it home. As to why my children call it home, I don't know. They've been there twice and were very young and kind of clueless like I was, but
yeah.
My husband's been there too, actually.
I have a question. I know both of your sets of children quite well, and I'm sitting here thinking about them as I'm listening to both of your stories, and I'm thinking, their stories are so different from yours, right? And I wonder if it's difficult for you to parent children knowing that their childhoods are so different to yours. And do you struggle as parents with sort of this American superiority complex that we seem to have in this country? Do your kids feel, do they subscribe to that American pride? And do you wish that they, I'm hearing you, Natalie, say that your children do identify with Haiti in some way. Do you wish that there was a closer connection? Do you feel that disconnect between your own upbringing and what you're doing now as parents? I think about that.
If I can, share. So I ask my daughter and Jordan, my son, and my daughter, what they identify as, and they say we're Mexican, we're Jewish, we're American, you know, they're all those things. You know, even though they haven't been to Mexico very much, I've taken them, but I talk about it all the time. So I talk about my grandparents, I talk about growing up in Tijuana, growing up in Mexico City. I talk to them about the old country, and I like using that term because that term is not just, you know, Eastern Europe, it's not just, you know, England or whatever. The old country is Mexico too, right? Trying to appropriate that. My mother gives me grief about them not speaking very much Spanish, and I've learned to let go of that because I think they have an awareness, both my kids have an awareness of, and we went to Israel about 4 years ago, so they have my son wore a kippah when he was in Jerusalem. The last couple of days we were there on his own, and that was revelatory for me. So they hold all kinds of multiple identities, which is not easy for them. In Jordan writing his essays for college entrance, he wrote about some of that, and I realized that it's not easy, and he wrote about that. So I kind of let go of them having similar identities as me when I realized, oh, they're not growing up in a border city, being able to go back and forth between two languages and two cultures, and being in these environments where they have Spanish-speaking aunts and uncles, you know, yakking away. They just don't have that, and that's okay. They have other things. Yeah.
That's funny that you said that because I think my kids, Elon and I speak French at home, especially when we don't want the kids to know what we're saying. But they have both taken up Duolingo. All of their cousins speak French. When I speak to my dad, it's in French. When I speak to my sisters, it's in French. My nieces and nephews are multilingual. I have a sister who lives in France, and the other one is stationed in Vietnam right now. But the commonality is French. And I don't know if the fact that, and then there's the stories, obviously, and then I have all the art, and I think it's a little bit of everything. But to answer your question of how are things different growing up or parenting children today, the goddamn internet. You know, the tablets, the instant gratification, that
As a challenge, you mean? As a challenge.
Yes, that is the biggest challenge. And I tell them all the time, when I was your age, I didn't have this, and we didn't watch TV and, you know, all of that stuff to try and make them realize how lucky they are. But at the same time, it really is handicapping.
I think, I mean, to teach gratitude is one of the biggest challenges as parents.
Yeah.
Yep.
It would be nice if this platform could actually be televised, because I think there's not enough of this gathering of knowing people's stories, and the fact that there's so much injustice in this country that I tell my wife a lot of times that I don't want to be here anymore because of the killing, because of the racism, because of that they have this entitlement. I heard this guy the other day said, if you are a Republican, you can't lie to the FBI. You can't tell a lie to this person. If you're a senator and you're going to lie, what kind of values are you teaching, or where are you coming from? You know, so it's very sickening that they think that they can do that, and it's okay for them to do that. But then if I did it, then if we be like,
We do need to tell these stories.
Not, you know?
We do need to
but
tell.
I think with Senor Guzman's platform, if you could put a group together and have it televised and show the world, because this history is not being taught in school.
Yeah.
You know, and there's
It's improving. Now we've got ethnic studies requirements at the public high school level, community college level, in the Cal State system. So things are improving. Yeah.
Just time for two more questions. Kim
Yeah.
and then Diane.
So I kind of want to piggyback on what Eduardo said. You know, I think something really great would be have something like the Human Library. It's where you have people that have, like you and yourself, where they put their information on like a board, and then people can check you out for 20 minutes, half hour, and then you hear different people's, and it's also good for people who have different sexual orientations or
Yeah.
anything different.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful thing. I went to one in 2015 at the main library, and it was just an awesome experience.
Thank you. Yeah, we have one more comment, then we'll wrap it up.
I always thought of my home as being where my parents were and where I grew up. Now, what about your children? Do they say, this is my home? I mean, you can think of home as being two places, your origin or the home where your parents show their love and you grow up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I agree.
Those are comments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll just wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and everybody online also. And this is going to be, this was streamed, so a recording is going to be made available pretty soon after. So, you know, if you want to share with any of your friends and family, go ahead and do so. Thanks to Sharon Brown, thanks to Temple Israel Long Beach, everybody here for being, you know, able to, so welcoming of these stories, and let's keep them going. Let's keep these stories coming. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Adolfo. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.